The elevator doors opened on the 31st floor, and Jonah Bennett's assistant said, very quietly, "Sir, there's a woman sitting at the head of your conference table eating a granola bar." Jonah didn't slow down. "What kind, pardon?" "What kind of granola bar?" His assistant, a careful young man named Russell, who had worked for Jonah for 2 years and had learned to translate every strange question into something useful, said, "Chocolate chip, I think. She has a tote bag." Jonah pushed open the glass door to the 31st floor suite. The woman at the head of his conference table, his specific chair, the one that faced the door and the window and the whole of downtown Vancouver, looked up when he walked in and said, "Oh good, you're early too." She had a site plan spread open across the table, his site plan. The one that had come back from the structural engineers that morning and hadn't yet been distributed to anyone. She had a pencil behind her ear and another one in her hand, and she was using both of them, apparently one to hold her place on the drawing and one to sketch notes in the margin. Jonah said, "I'm not early. This is my office." The woman looked around. She looked at the wall of windows. She looked at the framed site renderings. She looked at the tote bag she had set beside his chair and then back at Jonah. "Oh," she said. "Oh no." Her name, as she explained it approximately 40 seconds later while gathering her things at a speed that suggested genuine alarm, was Wren Calloway. She was a landscape architect. She was supposed to be on the 29th floor, which was where the planning firm she was meeting with had their offices. And she had pressed 31 by mistake because the elevator panel was worn and the numbers looked the same, and she had been distracted by her phone. And she was so sorry. She was so sorry. She would leave immediately. She had the site plan rolled up and under her arm before Jonah registered that she'd been reading it. "Where did you get that?" he said. She stopped. "It was on the table. It shouldn't have been on the table." "Well, it was." She held it out to him. "I wasn't trying to. I just saw it and I looked. Because it's beautiful work, genuinely. But the retention wall on the eastern boundary is going to be a problem, and I was just—" "What's wrong with the retention wall?" She blinked. She was maybe 31, with the kind of face that showed every thought she was having. Right now she was having several thoughts, and he could watch them move through her in sequence. Surprise, consideration, the brief internal argument about whether to say what she actually thought. She said what she actually thought. The grade change between the plaza level and the lower parkade is steeper than the drawings are showing. If you're going to have pedestrian access along that eastern edge, the wall as drawn doesn't account for the runoff pressure after a heavy rain. You'll get erosion in 3 years, maybe 4. And the way it's positioned, it'll undermine the foundation of the residential block before anyone notices. She said this very quickly, the way people do when they know they're right but aren't sure they'll be believed. Jonah looked at her. He had 3 structural engineers and one of the most expensive civil firms in Vancouver on this project. He had spent 6 weeks on the eastern boundary alone. He had looked at this drawing so many times he could reproduce it from memory. He said, "Wait here." Her name was Wren Calloway, and she had not, in fact, been planning to take any meetings that involved a billionaire developer, his structural site plan, or a conference table on the wrong floor of a tower in Cole Harbour. She had been planning to spend the morning with a planning firm reviewing soil compositions for a small public park in Burnaby, eat a mediocre lunch from the food cart she liked on Pender Street, and be home by 4 to let the neighbor's dog out, because the neighbor was elderly and it was the kind of thing you did. None of that was happening now. The developer, Jonah Bennett, she had recognized the name the moment Russell said it, because everyone in her field knew Jonah Bennett's name. He had built a third of the LEED certified residential development on the west side, was on the phone in the corner of the room. He had his back to her. He was speaking in the clipped, flat tone of someone managing a very specific kind of frustration, and she caught enough to understand that he was talking to someone at the civil firm. She sat back down. She wasn't sure why. The sensible thing was to leave. She had already apologized. She had already explained. The meeting downstairs had probably started without her, and she was going to have to send a flustered email, and there was granola bar crumbs on the head of Jonah Bennett's conference table, which was a sentence she had not expected to construct today. But she sat back down because the drawing was still in her hand, and because the eastern boundary problem was genuinely going to be a problem. And she had spent 8 years learning to see exactly that kind of thing. Jonah ended his call. He turned around. He looked at her in the chair. Not the head of the table this time. She had moved 3 seats down. She wasn't completely without social awareness. And he said, "The civil firm says the retention wall is within spec." "It's within spec for the load calculations," Wren said. It's not within spec for the grade change plus the drainage volume in that specific corner in a heavy rain event. They're different things. He sat down across from her. He had a quality she noticed of absolute stillness. Most people moved. Most people fidgeted or leaned or picked up their pen and set it down. Jonah Bennett sat in a chair the way a building sat on a foundation, without waste, without uncertainty, and looked at her with the focused attention of someone who had learned that most things worth knowing were worth knowing. Precisely. Show me, he said. She smoothed the drawing flat on the table. Here, she said, and here. See the contour lines? They're compressed here at the northeast corner, which means the grade change happens fast. Your wall is drawn for a standard 2-meter height, but the actual differential is closer to 3.2 in that section. In a standard year, it's probably fine. But in a heavy rain event, and you know what Vancouver rain looks like. I grew up in Vancouver, then you know. In a real rain, that corner becomes a collection point. The drainage can't handle the volume. The water has to go somewhere, and it goes into the slope, and the slope goes into the wall, and in 4 years, maybe less, you have a very expensive structural issue in a building people are living in. Jonah looked at the drawing for a long time. He did not look at her. He looked at the drawing, and she could see him seeing it, recalculating, running through the same sequence she had run through when she first looked. She recognized that look. She had worn it herself at 3 a.m, sitting on her apartment floor with sight drawings spread around her, finding the thing no one else had found. He picked up her pencil, the one she'd left on the table, not the one behind her ear, and made a mark on the drawing. How would you fix it, he said. She leaned forward, and she fixed it. 2 hours and 40 minutes later, Wren Calloway walked out of the 31st floor conference room, having redesigned the entire eastern pedestrian corridor of a $43 million mixed-use development in Cole Harbor, and stood in the elevator pressing the button for the lobby, and thought, I missed the meeting in Burnaby. She pulled out her phone. The email from the planning firm was patient and brief. Had everything gone all right? Should they reschedule? She was composing a response, somewhere between embarrassed and accurate, when the elevator stopped at 31 again and the doors opened. Jonah Bennett's assistant was standing there. Mr. Bennett would like to know, Russell said carefully, if you have time to speak with someone from the engineering team this afternoon. Wren looked at her phone. She looked at the lobby button she had pressed. She looked at Russell, who was holding the elevator door open with the expression of someone accustomed to delivering messages with unusual outcomes. I have a dog to let out at 4, she said. The meeting would be finished by 3:30. She stepped back into the elevator. She pressed 31. The engineering meeting ran until 6:15. At 4:17, Wren texted her elderly neighbor to ask if by any chance she was home, and her elderly neighbor Maureen texted back 3 minutes later. Already let him out. I heard him barking. Everything okay? Wren typed back, not totally sure. Long story. Thanks, Maureen. The engineering team, 4 of them, plus a site supervisor who had joined by video from the Burnaby satellite office, had initially been the very particular combination of polite and dismissive that she had spent a decade navigating as a woman in a room full of men who had been asked to take a second look at something they had already signed off on. She was used to it. She had learned to skip the part where she tried to soften the issue and go directly to the numbers, because numbers were either right or they weren't, and the specific grade differential in the northeast corner of the site was a number, and it was not what they had drawn it as. By 5:30, the site supervisor was the one with the pencil. By 6, they were talking about a redesign of the entire eastern access road, not just the retention wall, which was a much larger problem and also the right solution. At 6:15, when the engineering team had filed out and the site supervisor's video had ended, Jonah came back into the conference room. He had been in and out throughout the afternoon, present for long stretches and then absent, and she had noticed. She wasn't sure when she had started noticing that he always came back. He sat in the chair across from her. He looked at the new drawings spread across the table, the ones they had roughed out over the last 2 hours, her handwriting in the margins alongside the site supervisor's. Thank you, he said. She looked up from the drawing she was rolling. I walked into the wrong room, yes, and ate a granola bar at your table. The chocolate chip ones are better than the plain ones. I keep the plain ones for meetings I want to end. She looked at him. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite the stillness he moved through the world with, but something between the two. How long have you been in landscape architecture, he said. 8 years. Before that, I did my undergrad in environmental science at Dalhousie. Moved to Vancouver for the master's program and then She made a small gesture. Stayed. Where are you based now? I have a small practice, just me and one other person, my business partner Sear. We mostly do parks, civic spaces, some residential landscape work. Nothing at this scale. She nodded at the drawings. You'd handled something at this scale before. It wasn't a question quite, so she answered it honestly. Once, in Halifax before I moved, a waterfront development. The drainage issues were different, but the principles were the same. He nodded. He was looking at the drawing again, not at her, but she had the sense that he was also looking at her, or thinking about her in the specific way that meant someone was collecting information and not yet sure what to do with it. She finished rolling the drawing. She put her pencil back in her tote bag. I should go, she said. We're going to need a new landscape plan for the eastern boundary, Jonah said. The corridor redesign changes the pedestrian access entirely. The current landscape architecture firm has been briefed on the original drawings, but if the drawings change significantly, which they will, we'll need someone who understands the problem from the inside. She was still. That's not how project contracts work, she said. There's a firm already engaged. You can't just, I can discuss it with them. There are ways to structure a collaboration. He stood up. He was taller than she had registered when she'd been focused on the drawings. I'm not asking you to make a decision right now. I'm telling you the situation. That's a very particular way of telling me something. He almost smiled again. It was subtle. The kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. But she was paying attention. Have you eaten? He said. She had not eaten since the granola bar. She had been in a meeting for 6 hours and had not eaten and had apparently forgotten to notice. No, she said. There's a place 2 blocks east that's good. We could talk through the project structure and you could decide whether you're interested. That sounds like a dinner meeting. Yes. She considered this. She considered the 31st floor, which she had arrived at by accident. She considered the drawing, now rolled under her arm, with her handwriting in the margins of a $43 million project. She considered Jonah Bennett, who was not warm, exactly, but was precise and honest, and had listened to her for 6 hours with the full weight of his attention, which was more than most people offered. All right, she said. They walked out of the conference room and down the hall, and Russell watched them go, with the expression of someone who had worked for Jonah Bennett for 2 years and had learned not to be surprised by anything, but who was, quietly, a little surprised by this. The dinner meeting lasted 2.5 hours. She ordered the salmon. He ordered the same because he ate from a short list of things and it simplified decisions, which was a sentence she filed away and thought about later. They talked about the project for the first hour, and the second hour was a mixture of the project and other things. The way conversations tilt when both people have stopped performing and started talking. And somewhere in the third hour she realized they were no longer talking about the project at all. He had grown up in East Vancouver, he said. His father had been a contractor. He had spent his childhood on job sites, which was where he had learned that the problem was never the thing that looked like the problem. The problem was always the thing underneath, the thing that had been let go too long or covered too quickly or measured by someone who was in a hurry. She said that was why she'd gone into landscape architecture. Because everything visible grew from something invisible, and if you wanted to understand the thing you could see, you had to understand the system underneath it. Soil, water, grade. The way a space felt was almost never about what you could see directly. It was about the structure underneath the thing you saw. He said he had spent 20 years trying to explain that to people. She said she had spent 8 years trying to explain that to people. They looked at each other across the table. You mentioned a business partner, he said. Suer say yes. She handles the business side. I handle the design side. It works because she's extremely organized and I am extremely not. What does that mean, not organized? I lose things. Not important things. I have a system, but the system is only intelligible to me. I have a particular relationship with deadlines where I meet them, but only just. And my office looks like a creative environment, which is a polite way of saying there are site plans on every surface, including the floor. He was looking at her. That's not a problem, she said. The outcomes are always right. The process is just, she shrugged. My last project ran 3 weeks behind schedule, he said, because a junior analyst misread a setback bylaw and we didn't catch it until the permit stage. That's a different problem. That's a process problem. Yes, what I do is I don't know what to call it. An intuition problem. I have to let things be uncertain for a while before I can see what they want to be. That makes some people very uncomfortable. Does it make you uncomfortable? No, it makes me confident, actually. When I finally know what something wants to be, I know it completely. He was quiet for a moment. That, he said, is the most useful thing I've heard in a long time." The project contract took 3 weeks to structure. The existing landscape firm, a larger outfit that had been engaged for the original drawings, was gracious about the collaboration. More gracious than they needed to be, which Wren appreciated, because she was joining their project and they could have made it difficult. Instead, the principal sent her a site visit invitation on her first day and showed her everything she needed to know, and they became something that resembled colleagues, and later something that resembled friends. Circe, when Wren told her, said, "You walked into the wrong room and redesigned a $43 million development." "I was eating a granola bar," Wren said. "You were eating a granola bar," Circe agreed, with the tone of someone accepting a fact they could not make sense of. The project itself was extraordinary, not in the way that things were extraordinary in press releases, but in the quiet way of being given a problem large enough to demand everything you had and discovering that you had enough. The Eastern Corridor alone took 6 weeks of site visits, soil analysis, 3 rounds of revised drainage plans, and 1 significant argument with the civil engineering firm about the relationship between surface permeability and load-bearing capacity, which Wren won, and which she was gracious about winning because she had been wrong about something else the week before, and they had been gracious then. Jonah was in and out of the process. He reviewed the drawings. He asked questions that were brief and always precisely the right questions, the ones that identified the thing underneath the thing she was showing him. She began to understand that this was how he worked, not by managing every detail himself, but by knowing which details contained the real problem. She also began to understand that he was watching her, not in the way that was intrusive, but in the way that someone watches a thing they are trying to understand. She was watching him too. She didn't examine that too closely. In October, 4 months into the project, there was a site review with the city's Development Permit Board, and one of the board members raised a concern about the pedestrian corridor width along the northern boundary. It was a legitimate concern. The original drawings had been generous with space, and the redesign had narrowed the corridor slightly to accommodate the drainage revision, and the board member presented it with the specific energy of someone who had decided the answer was no before asking the question. Wren had the grade data. She had the drainage models. She had the pedestrian flow analysis she had commissioned from a firm in Montreal because she had wanted to be certain. She laid it all out calmly, in the precise order that made the argument build like a structure, each piece load-bearing, nothing decorative. The board approved the permit. In the hallway afterward, Jonah said, "The Montreal analysis was good." He looked at her. There it was again, the almost smile. The thing between stillness and warmth. "You're not modest," he said. "I'm accurate," she said. "There's a difference." "Yes," he said. "There is." The first time he called her on a Saturday, she was on the roof of her apartment building trying to figure out why the tenant garden she'd helped her building super set up 2 years ago wasn't draining properly. She was on her knees in the soil when her phone rang, and she answered it with dirty gloves still on, which meant she held it against her shoulder with her ear, which was not dignified. "It's Jonah." "I know," she said. "I have caller ID." A pause. "The revised drainage report came in from the civil team." "I know. I read it this morning. What did you think?" She sat back on her heels. The roof garden smelled like wet soil and cedar, and the North Shore Mountains were doing what they did on clear October mornings, which was unreasonably beautiful. "I think they're still underestimating the volume in the northeast section," she said. "But not by as much as before. They're getting closer. I thought the same thing. Did you call me on a Saturday to tell me we agreed?" Another pause. Longer. "I called," Jonah said, "because I was going to the site this afternoon and thought you might want to come." She looked at her dirty gloves. She looked at the tenant garden, which was going to need another hour at least. She looked at the mountains. "What time?" she said. 2. "I'll meet you there." She hung up and stayed on her knees in the soil for another moment, and did not examine what she was feeling, because she had learned that some things needed to be uncertain for a while before you could see what they wanted to be. The site visit lasted 3 hours. She had been to the site many times by then, but never with Jonah on a quiet Saturday when the trades were absent and the structure was half-built and the light came through the concrete frames at the angles that showed you what the building was going to be. He walked her through sections she hadn't seen. He explained decisions she hadn't known he'd made. He had been involved in every choice, she realized, not just at the planning level, but at the level of materials, of light, of what it would feel like to walk through a specific doorway. He cared about it the way she cared about the soil systems under a park, not as a product, as a thing that would exist in the world and affect the people who moved through it. She said, standing in the half-built eastern lobby with the Coal Harbor Inlet visible through the open construction aperture. Your father was a contractor. Yes. Is that where this comes from? Caring what it feels like. He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the inlet. He used to say that a building was a promise, Jonah said. That when you built something, you were promising the people who would live in it that you had thought about them. That you hadn't just solved a problem and moved on. She understood that completely. She understood it the way you understood things that matched something already in you. The Eastern Corridor, she said, is going to be good. I know, he said. He turned and looked at her, and it was different from the way he had looked at her on the 31st floor when she had been correcting his site plan. Different from the way he looked at drawings and proposals and engineering reports. It was direct and quiet and held nothing back, the way he did everything when he had decided something. She looked back at him. The construction site was silent around them. The mountains were doing it again. The inlet was flat and gray-blue, and the light was the particular quality of late October afternoon in Vancouver, which was gold and horizontal and made everything look like something you'd remember. Wren, he said. Yes, she said. She wasn't answering a question. She was agreeing to something they hadn't yet said out loud. It was February when the Eastern Corridor broke ground. The design had evolved through 4 full revisions since October, each one better than the last, and on the morning the first machines moved earth on the newly graded site plan, she stood at the site perimeter and watched and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing moving from drawing to ground. Jonah was beside her. He had brought 2 coffees from the cart on Pender Street, the one she liked, which meant he had gone 4 blocks out of his way. She accepted her cup. Your retention wall is going to be exactly right, she said. Your drainage system is going to outlast the building, he said. She laughed. She didn't do it quietly. He looked at her sideways with that expression she had catalogued over 5 months. The stillness that was not coldness, the warmth that didn't perform itself, and the corner of his mouth moved. I walked into the wrong room, she said. You did, and ate your granola bar. You did, and now I'm here. He handed her the coffee and she took it, and the machines began their slow work on the eastern boundary, and the corridor that had almost been wrong was now completely right. And Wren Calloway stood in the February cold watching something she had made becoming real, and thought that this was, all told, the most interesting wrong turn she had ever taken. 3 months later, on a Saturday, standing on that same roof garden above her apartment, which drained perfectly now, she had fixed it in November, Jonah asked her to marry him. He did not get down on one knee, he did not have a ring in a box. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, directly, precisely, without decoration. She said yes. Circe said when told, you were eating a granola bar. I was, Wren said. In the wrong room, in the wrong room. Circe sat with that for a moment. Okay, she said. Okay, that tracks. They were married in October, in the building's completed garden. The Eastern Corridor finished and green, the retention wall holding exactly as calculated, the North Shore Mountains visible through the trees that Wren had specified and planted and known from the beginning, would grow exactly this way. The soil was right, the drainage was right, the grade was right. Everything underneath was right, and so everything visible was exactly what it was supposed to be. She had known, once she could see it clearly, completely.